My name is Drew Waldron, and I'm once again on with Brown University professor and economist Mark Blyth. Mark, thank you so much for making the time.
Oh, always a pleasure to be with you.
Definitely. The last time that you and I talked, it was about a year ago, and you were doing research for your newest book, Inflation, A Guide for Users and Losers. And now that book is releasing in May. What prompted you and your co-author to write about inflation?
Well, what actually happened was my co-author, Nick, was my postdoc at the time. He's now an economist at the World Bank. And he came in and said, we should write a book about inflation. And I said, why? Because we understand what it is and how it works. And he said, but there's something weird with this that we never really noticed, which is kind of the distributional story in it, which is it's simply not true that we're all hurt by inflation, right? And I'll give you an example of this, right? So if you're on a fixed income, relatively low wages, and eggs prices double and gas prices double and all that sort of stuff, it absolutely takes a big punch out of you, right? You're a loser in that case. Let me give you a really startling statistic, right? In 2022, American carbon majors, that is oil firms, right, because of the spike in oil prices and gas prices, made an extra $220 billion in profit. Now, who gets all that money? Well, the people who own those shares, okay? Over 50% of shares are owned by the top 1%. So let's give them 50% of the share value increase and 50% of the dividends. And what you're saying is that 3.3 million people in the United States, at the top of the income distribution, each got a share of 110 billion. They were overcompensated for inflation. Whatever effect they saw at the grocery store, and you have to remember, like, the further up the income distribution you are, the less you spend on basic goods, the more you get compensated. So that is interesting. That's interesting. Let's actually think about that, because we don't often think about who wins and who loses in this one. And then the second thing was realizing that what we do every time this happens is go back and raise interest rates. And if the problem is a supply shock, which is what it seemed to be, both the COVID shutdown and then that was compounded by the oil price crisis, the Ukraine effect, etc. Why is raising the price of money, which primarily affects things like the housing market and business investment, the right response to something that is a totally different thing, which is an oil shock or a supply shock? And we went back and started to look at why we think this way. And it's because we got all of our ideas about inflation from the 1970s, the last time we saw one. Maybe we're in a really different world now, and that playbook that we draw from the 1970s is not appropriate. And that's kind of what we just followed through, those two things. Who wins, who loses in real terms? And why do we keep thinking this, we're in the 70s when we're obviously not?
Definitely very clearly outlining who the users are, who the losers are. Theoretically, if a loser was to read your book, what do you think are the biggest messages that they should take away from this new project?
Well, there's not much you can do to protect yourself if you are basically a loser, in the sense that you're going to be hit by inflation because you're on a fixed income, low wages, etc., and you're susceptible to these things. The key thing is, if you spend most of your money on consumption goods, right, then you're going to get hit by rises in the price of consumption goods. If you're richer and you spend less of that, you're going to be less affected. So there's not much you can do on an individual level, but what you can do is basically protect yourself from the stories that people will tell you that this is an everyone problem. It's really not an everyone problem. It's a specific part of the income distribution that tends to get most hit by this. Now, the story for income is straightforward. The story for wealth is actually not as straightforward. And there's some evidence out there that it's primarily the kind of people in the middle and the upper middle that lose most here because of things like rising interest rates, etc. But they also gain, in the sense that those interest rates also pay more on the assets that you've got. Everything from your savings account to whatever bonds you've got in your retirement account. So we just try and unpack all this and basically say, you know, how to think about this in terms of where you are and how you're likely to be hurt or benefited by it.
And in your book, there is a classification that I love. You claim that there are three types of inflation. You say that there's the good, the bad, and the ugly. Now,
Yeah.
if you don't know, what differentiates those three?
So this is from a piece from a guy at the ECB called Hugo Pagano from a couple of years. I think it was Pagano. But anyway, his basic one, you know, lifting off of Sergio Leone and the spaghetti westerns, the good, bad, and the ugly. So what is good inflation? Well, you don't want to have zero inflation. If you have zero inflation, right, prices would never rise. If firms were in competitive markets, they'd cut prices. You start to get into a deflation. That's bad. You want to have basically a slightly positive rate of inflation, and preferably a rate of growth that's slightly higher than that, and then you're in a good position, right? This is how economists tend to think about it. Bad inflation. What's bad inflation? Well, bad inflation is kind of what happened to us. Supply shocks, price of basic goods go up, that that filters through into other markets. Firms jump on that, start to take advantage of it, push up their margins. And then ugly inflation is what you get when you get hyperinflation, which is the big nightmare that sort of lurks in the background. And what we do in the book is we go through 4 examples of very famous hyperinflations. So Venezuela and Argentina in the recent past, Weimar Germany is another one, of course, Zimbabwe and its sort of entire post-colonial history. And what we show is that these countries have so many problems that manifest themselves in an inflationary crisis that simply thinking that when we have 2% inflation, good inflation, that you go to bad inflation, 10% inflation, inexorably you go to 50% a month, hyperinflation. It's not the case. It doesn't work like that. These are vanishingly small cases. And that's kind of what we wanted to show by making that distinction.
Bringing back to US economics, it's really tough to talk about the economy without bringing politics and current events into the conversation. And the last time that you and I spoke, you compared your predictive outcomes for a Democratic versus a Republican win in the 2024 election. And at the time of this recording, we are firmly about a week into the second Trump presidency. What are the biggest economic changes that you see coming within the next 4 years for the US?
The next 4 years, things are happening at such a pace and in such randomness that it's hard to keep pace for like 4 days. I think we should take the administration at its word. It wants to double down on carbon assets. It's basically ending America's attempt at any form of green industrialization or green transition. There are massive costs associated with doing so in the long term, but I don't think they really care about that. It's more of a short-term focus. Nobody saw the Greenland thing coming. Nobody saw the let's take over Canada thing coming. So who knows where that one plays out. We've most recently had a stop today in all federal agency spending, which is going to have huge complex repercussions right throughout sort of American society, because it turns out the government spends a lot of money. So if you're going to stop and do an audit of all of that and nobody gets paid, that's going to be quite consequential. So I think at this point, my lodestone on this is to basically watch what they do on what I call carbon assets, right? Basically privileging the business model of the states, of the core Republican states, which are essentially those tied to carbon, fuel, farms, fertilizer, food, etc., etc. That's what I keep my eye on because everything else is a little bit too chaotic.
That's a very, very good point. But within all that chaos, especially in the last week, we have seen so much of a status competition within the billionaire class. What is your read on that? A competition between Musk and Altman. Why and what is going to be the ultimate outcome of that?
So it's interesting you should say status competition there. For those who are wondering where that comes from, there was an economist, an institutional economist called Thorstein Veblen, who wrote at the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century. At one point, he was America's most influential economist back in the day. And he basically wondered why you get these big investment bubbles. And his argument was they didn't use the term billionaires, right? But basically what you got was a status competition amongst the very top of the investor class. So rather than Musk think JP Morgan, whatever it happens to be, and whatever the new hot thing is, whether it's railroads or radio stocks, or in this case, AI, when you have super concentrated wealth that already has basically a foothold in this sector, then what you tend to get is a kind of status competition amongst these very top investors that I will be the one that commits, I will be the one that gets the transformative technology. And, in a sense, that's my immortality. And it's not a very fashionable way of looking at it, but I think these days it's a really accurate way of looking at it. What we saw the other day with the Chinese knockoff of AI performing just as well, and then the 15% wiped off the share price of NVIDIA, is something that I think we spoke about it last time as well, something that I've long been suspicious of, which is there's a huge amount of a hype bubble in this. The final use cases of AI have yet to be defined. The basic business model is one of us will win and then we will have a monopoly and we exploit everyone else. I'm not sure that's sustainable. In terms of the predictions for it, a couple of years ago when it first appeared, all the cancer researchers, or rather cancer diagnostic technicians, they were going to be replaced with AI because it was so much more accurate, and none of that's happened. And all of this is very eerily reminiscent of what happened in the 2010s. There was a slew of books and reports from the OECD and Oxford Business School about before we had AI, we had machine learning and sort of deep computing power, etc. And all of this was the race against the machine. And there were all these reports that 50 to 60% of all jobs would be replaced by automation by 2016 or 2020. And all of that proved to be utterly wrong. But it's really good for valuations if you can keep these stories going. So if you have these types of like hype bubble valuations going into sectors, and then you have that status competition going on with the investor class, you get enormously stretched valuations, and those things are very, very vulnerable.
So when you talk about the 15% that was wiped off of Nvidia's stock and how a lot of that is due to hype and everyone putting their eggs in the basket of AI, you mentioned that it's a bubble. What do you think the bubble popping will look like?
Well, I said stretched valuations. I didn't actually use the word bubble, right? You only know bubbles when they pop. Now, in order for these valuations to be sustained, what that means is eventually the returns from owning these assets must generate the amount of cash flow that you need in order to borrow all that money to do this. And the big fear now is we've built all these data centers, and it turns out China can do it for 5 million, and it cost us 5 billion. Whoops. The other side of it is, what if this actually is not the transformative technology we're looking for, right? It could be this incredible thing, but over the past 2 years, we're still to hear the definitive sort of hype cases, the definitive use cases for this, I should say, rather than hype cases. A good parallel with this is I've been waiting about 15 years for the blockchain revolution. Apparently, it's coming every day. And every time I met someone each year, I got a new thing as to what it was the killer app for, whether it was smart contracts or something else. And none of this stuff really seems to have actually bubbled up and done what it said it would do. So I think investors are now beginning to say, wait a minute, is this really going to be this huge thing? Or ultimately, have we done something useful? We've taken Google, stuck a large language model on it with a natural language interface, and now you can ask straightforward questions and you get straightforward answers, which is pretty cool. Is it sort of the transformation of everything? Maybe people are beginning to get a bit skeptical about that, particularly with the extraordinarily high capex that goes into it on the front. If you don't have a business model on the back end to pull this out, you're going to have problems.
Definitely. I feel like as you focus so much about current events, current news, it's easy to get bleak conversationally. So I think a good question to end on, Mark, is what are you optimistic about in the future?
I'm optimistic on the human race. I mean, we do stupid stuff to ourselves all the time. I'll close by talking about carbon because that's what I'm interested in now. I take the following attitude. It really doesn't matter what me, you, or anyone else thinks about, climate change or global warming. The fact is, it's physics. If you keep dumping methane and carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, the place warms up. Now, why is this significant? It's significant because large parts of the United States are already becoming uninsurable. Last week, I think it was, one of the big insurers, possibly Allstate, pushed up their Illinois premiums by about 14%. Why did they do this? Because they're making catastrophic losses everywhere else, because billion-dollar losses that used to be sort of once or twice a year are now happening multiple times every year. You can't really do capitalism without insurance. So let me give you an example of this. Think about how important houses are for the US economy, building them, renting them, selling them, swapping them, using them as ATMs. This is a huge part of what we do. You can't have a mortgage unless you get insurance. If your insurance becomes either unaffordable or unavailable, that will have a massive impact on people's ability to buy, sell, and build homes. So whether we like it or not, we need to have some set of policies that address not just the insurance failure, the state takes it on the balance sheet and we continue as usual, but what are we going to do about the underlying problem, which is this climate is destabilizing and producing these storms, and these storms are very costly. Unfortunately, my main worry about the administration going forward is that they don't seem to be focused on that at all. In fact, they're quite literally in denial and figuratively in denial about it. But I think that there's a great line from Harold Macmillan, the British Prime Minister in the 1950s, who was asked by a journalist who says, so what do you look for on the horizon? What do you think are the things that are important? And he said, events, dear boy, events. Things just happen. And those things, like insurance markets suddenly becoming unaffordable, doesn't matter what you think, you're going to have to address it. And if you want to address it seriously, you're going to have to get back onto thinking about carbon. Second thing is, China must be laughing their proverbial pants off on this one, because they've already, for the past 10 years, decided that they're going to be the main supplier of every single strategic green tech and hard tech sector that everyone's going to buy in the 21st century because of climate change. And the IRA in the US was an attempt to basically get some of that back. And now it seems we're just going to give up on this. And that just leaves the place open to China to basically sell it to the rest of the world. I'm optimistic that we will recognize the error of that and try and connect it rather than deny our ways to an unsustainable future.
I hope so too, and I'm shocked as you're telling me that Mother Nature doesn't care about the market. I'm
Yeah,
just
it's real. I know. You'd think she has a portfolio, but she doesn't. I know. Who knew? Who knew?
well, very well said, Mark. Mark, thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it.
Always a pleasure.